On today's episode of Locked On Wild, how'd the Florida Panthers win the Stanley Cup? Well, one of the ways is right down the middle.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild. We are your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, and we are your team every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we'll dive in to the Florida Panthers and how they were able to secure the Stanley Cup this past season, beating the Edmonton Oilers. Take a look at some of the key things that led to their strong season and overcoming a deficit in the Stanley Cup final to take care of business. We'll see if there are any lessons that the Wild can learn as they try to do the same over the next few years. My name is Seth Toupal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and Florida Panthers had a great season from start to finish. One of the best teams in the NHL all season long. They extended that into the postseason. They ran into a little bit of trouble against the Edmonton Oilers, but they persevered and were able to win that series and hoist the Stanley Cup trophy. Some of the things that stand out to me the most about what the Panthers were able to do, they were fourth in the NHL in points. And so they obviously, in racking up 52 wins, that was tied for second most in the entirety of the NHL. But they did so in a pretty sustainable format, a pretty consistent format. You look where they were at offensively. They ranked 11th in the NHL in goals at 265. But goals allowed, they were number one, tied with the Winnipeg Jets at 198 goals against. And so if you go goals for per game, they were at 3.23. Goals against per game, they were at 2.41. Special teams, the Florida Panthers were 8th in the league with 23.5%, so a top 10 unit there. And on the penalty kill, the Florida Panthers were 6th on the penalty kill at 82.5%. And so for the Panthers, they were able to be in the top 10, and not just in the top 10, but, higher up in the top 10 in all of those key areas. And this is not what I want to, focus on here for today's show. Just want to point out some of the things that were going for the Panthers all season that the Wilds can pull from. You look at the stats. Obviously, Sam Reinhart had the absurdly good season with 57 goals and 94 points. But you look at the other players who contributed from a goal standpoint. Carter Verhaeghe had 34 goals. Matthew Tkachuk had 26. Aleksander Barkov had 23. Sam Bennett had 20. Same amount of players as the Minnesota Wilds that had 20 or more goals. The Wild had 5. Florida had 5. Now, obviously, 57 on the top end is a lot, but I think the big difference, from just a lineup perspective, is the number of guys that contributed more than that. You go from the players that had at least 10 goals. You got Gustav Forsling with 10, Kevin Stenlund with 10, Evan Rodriguez with 10, Eetu Luostarinen with 12. Anton Lindell had 13 himself. And then you had Oliver Ekman-Larsson with 9, Brandon Montour with 8, Nick Cousins had 7. They swung the trade to bring Vladimir Tarasenko in to help out the lineup. He had 6 in 19 games for the Florida Panthers. And so you've got just a bunch of guys that are maybe not contributing at that 20 goal level, but are contributing lower down in the lineup. And I want to just look at the top 6 for this Florida Panthers team. Carter Verhaeghe. Now, there have been some players that have moved on from the Florida Panthers here in the offseason, but you're still rolling with Carter Verhaeghe, Aleksander Barkov, Sam Reinhart, Matthew Tkachuk, Sam Bennett, and Evan Rodriguez as your top 6, which you can throw that toe-to-toe against pretty much anybody in the league. Eetu Luostarinen, Anton Lindell, Mackie Samoskevich, Jesper Boquist, Thomas Nosek, and Mackenzie Entwistle make up the bottom 2 lines for that Florida Panthers team. And so you've got the defined top 6. You've got the no question top 6 for that Florida Panthers team. And you look at the numbers even for a guy like Evan Rodriguez, who last year, as I mentioned, had 12 goals. He's a guy who is 1 season removed from having an 18-goal season, I believe, with the Colorado Avalanche. And so you've got guys that are capable of providing that depth scoring, but you also have a top 6 that is perfectly capable of being able to carry you as needed. Now, we talk about the consistency offensively, defensively, and all the way through the season. The Panthers had predominantly all of their starts from 2 goalies, Sergei Bobrovsky and Anthony Stolarz. And for Bobrovsky, he came on really strong as the season went along to set himself up to take the reins back once the postseason started. And so that consistency in goaltending for the Panthers really helped them down the stretch as well. He, with the exception of a handful of starts, here or there, he was fantastic throughout the postseason. I remember the debates about, well, Bobrovsky should be the one winning winning all the postseason accolades, but you have to have all of those elements consistently. You don't need to necessarily be, top of the line from a, you don't need to be top of the line in all of these different statistical measurements, but you got to be near the upper half at least, bare minimum, because we know throughout the course of seasons, the offense is going to struggle. And so then you need your defense to be able to pick it up and pick up the slack. Sometimes your defense is going to struggle, and you need the offense to be able to carry the load until everything kind of gets back on track. The Florida Panthers were, from the start of the season, pretty consistent all the way through. They avoided any sort of major losing streaks because, again, they've got those defined elements that you need to have if you are a championship team. And look no further than the guy behind the bench and Paul Maurice, who put it all together, got this team in position to be able to compete for a Stanley Cup. But I think the thing that I like most about what Paul Maurice brings to the table is that he knows when he needs to push and he knows when he can back off. He knows what he needs to get from his team for them to be good. He knows what he needs from his players. He knows what buttons to push with particular guys. But he always does what he needs to do in order to get the most out of that lineup. And so as we begin this journey of kind of looking back at how these different Stanley Cup teams have done things over the last few years, for the Florida Panthers, it was a build off of getting to the Stanley Cup final 2 seasons ago. And it was something that they just continued to execute throughout all of this season and all the way through to the end of the mountain. Now, there are going to be some elements that we pull from each of these teams that stick out to me the most. And for the Florida Panthers, the depth that they possess right down the middle is the thing that I think jumps out at me the most about their formula, their method. And so we'll talk about just how deep the Florida Panthers are at the center position as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, you know me, I love sports. I love them so much, I never want them to stop. But with the playoffs fully in the rearview mirror, with the NFL season getting their preseason underway, with Major League, with the NBA and the NHL still a few months away, the sports just aren't sporting the way that I want them to. But FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you are in the mood. If you listen to Locked On NHL, you know one of my favorite suggestions is to just find who the Chicago White Sox are playing. And if you're in an area where you can legally do so, throw some bets down on Chicago to lose. They're playing the New York Yankees right now. That's as safe of a bet. Although, as I say that, I realize that Chicago got the win in game one of the series. So not making my formula look particularly good, but trust me, a team that's 29-91, odds are you're going to get what you're looking for if you take the other team. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. A couple of reminders for you. Our Locked On Wild sweepstakes continues, and you can get involved by sending us proof that you subscribe to Locked On Wild on YouTube. All you have to do is just take a photo showing that you are a subscriber and put your name in the email. Send it to lockedonwild@gmail.com. That's all you need, and you are entered in for the opportunity to win 2 tickets to see the Minnesota Wild take on the Columbus Blue Jackets on opening night. Also, we've got the meet and greet coming up on August 25th at Zamboni's from 12 to 3. We'll be doing a live show. We have a ton of guests lined up. We're working on adding some more, and it should be a great time. So stop out to Zamboni's on 7th, right across from the XL Energy Center, for your chance to stop out and say hi as we really kind of kick things into gear with the final few weeks before the preseason gets going. Should be a great time. Sunday, August 25th at Zamboni's on 7th. So we talk about the Florida Panthers and what it took for them to be able to win the Cup. Now, playing style and being able to play with primarily speed, but also with physicality when necessary came into play in a couple of the series that they had en route to the Stanley Cup final. So you need to have physicality. And so as much as we discuss wanting to see speed and skill, physicality is a part of the game. But here's the key difference. It feels like, and we talked about this quite a bit, it feels like the Minnesota Wild are a team that plays physically, that can play with speed and skill when necessary. But pretty much every other NHL team is a team with speed and skill that can play with physicality when necessary. And so it feels like they're kind of flipped. They're on the wrong side of the equation to where they need to be. But the other thing that just jumps right off the page at me with this Florida Panthers team is their center depth. And the list of names is just unbelievably impressive that they are able to throw in the mix. It starts with Aleksander Barkov, the Selke Trophy winner, one of the best defensive forwards in the league, but also a guy who can be a 25 to a 30 goal scorer and just sets the tone for them at every single level. You go from that to Sam Bennett. You go from that to Anton Lindell. You go from that to Tomas Nozick. Last year, the Panthers had Kevin Stenlund, a physical fourth-line center who also was an ace on the penalty kill. And not only that, but the number of players who had face-offs on this Panthers franchise, there were a ton of them that took a meaningful level of face-offs. You had Barkov, you had Anton Lindell, you had Kevin Stenlund, Sam Bennett, Sam Reinhart as your primary five. 3 of those 5, and the ones that took the most face-offs, were at 50% or better. Barkov was at 57%. Lundell was at 54.9%. Stenlund, 51.4%. Sam Bennett was at 45.5%. And Sam Reinhart at 44.2%. But you had plenty of other players that were capable of taking faceoffs as well. We've talked about faceoffs. If you're an everydayer to Locked On Wild, we've talked about faceoffs quite a bit. And low faceoff win percentage numbers may not tell the entirety of the story. But what do we know about faceoffs? It's not about winning the faceoff per se. It's what you do with it. And more often than not, this Florida Panthers team puts themselves in positions to do something with a faceoff win. And if you're Aleksander Barkov and you're taking all the faceoffs for the Florida Panthers or all the meaningful ones, it's likely that all the other key ingredients for that Florida Panthers offense are going to be on that line as well, whether it be Matthew Tkachuk or Sam Bennett or Sam Reinhart, because they've got good depth, but they've also got really good versatility for a lot of their upper level guys. And for Barkov, he has been on a similar trajectory to what we've seen from Joel Eriksson Ek, where he just continues to get better and better. He's been a Selke winner now 2 times. He's finished in the top 5 a handful of times. And it really feels like he just is the one that sets the tone for everything that team is looking to do from both an offensive and a defensive standpoint. But Sam Bennett, he's a guy who is capable of being a very heavy hitter. He is somebody who can give you, 20 goals, can give you between 40 and 50 points. These guys all just feed off of each other. And you've got Reinhart now, who has been a 30-goal guy the last couple of years, elevated now to a 57 goals with this Panthers team. But guys that know their role too. Kevin Stenlund, who we talked about, he was essentially a penalty kill ace on the 4th line, but he helped on the penalty kill and he won faceoffs. Those are the 2 things that he did for the Panthers this past season, and he did them incredibly well. And then on the 3rd line, you've got Anton Lindell, and he does the exact same thing. They just do their jobs as centers, which is to win faceoffs, to get things set up, and you look at the size too. Barkov is 6'3", 215. Bennett, 6'1", 195. Reinhart is 6'2", 193. Stenlund was 6'4", 211. Lindell, 6'1", 185. So they have some size at the center position, but I think all of them are just adept at both offense and defense. I think that's the key, is that all the centers that the Panthers throw at you, they're good on both sides of the puck. They're good offensively, but they can also give you some good things defensively as well. I mean, Sam Bennett had 173 hits in 69 games. Barkov had 104. Kevin Stenlund had 83 in 81 games. Sam Reinhart had 78 hits in 82 games. Eetu Luostarinen, who played some center but more of a wing, bottom 6 guy, 129 hits. It's a Panthers team that can hit you literally but can also get the puck in the back of the net. And so you look at that, the two things that I take away from the Florida Panthers and what they were able to do is they have enviable depth at the center position, but they also have enviable top six scoring that helped them all the way through to be able to get to the Stanley Cup final and to hoist the Stanley Cup trophy. And so let's talk about how the Wild can approach this, how they can learn from this Stanley Cup winning season, and what the Wild need to do in order to get to a similar spot with where the Florida Panthers are at right now. We'll discuss that as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For tomorrow, we will be taking a look at the Vegas Golden Knights. We're just going to go over the last few years. Florida, Vegas. We'll talk about Colorado and Tampa Bay. I think will be the final two to end the week. Then we'll be moving into some crossovers and continuing to push through the offseason, gearing you up for the start of the season, for preseason, for all of that coming up here in September. So how do the Minnesota Wilds handle this, trying to build a top six that models Florida and trying to get center depth that models what Florida did? Well, there are a couple of ways to look at this. Number one, the Panthers didn't draft and develop all these guys that they currently deploy on their roster. They took advantage of players wanting to move on from their current situations and trying to build a core that could put them in position to be able to be a legitimate contender. On the Barkov side of things, he was the one of them. He was the one of all the players that make their top six. He was the one that was drafted by the team and he's the true draft and develop of that group. So draft and develop, file that away as one part of this coin. Matthew Tkachuk, originally from the Calgary Flames, got to the point with Calgary where he felt, hey, I don't know if this is going to work. I kind of want to see what else is out there. And so the Panthers made the trade of Jonathan Huberdeau to the Calgary Flames in exchange for Matthew Tkachuk, which has given them a bona fide top six guy. Like, there's no question that Matthew Tkachuk is a top six guy. He's probably more of a top line guy, but with the options that the Panthers have at their disposal, they can put him on the second line and they're going to be just fine. Sam Reinhart, originally with the Buffalo Sabres. Reinhart got to the same point. Him and Jack Eichel got to the same conclusion at basically the same time, that it's time to move on. It's not working here. Let's go explore other options. Eichel went to Vegas. Reinhart went to the Florida Panthers. And Sam Bennett, previously with the Calgary Flames, but then brought to the Florida Panthers as well. And so, you look at the things that Bill Zito has done as general manager of the Florida Panthers. He's been very aggressive. And, Bennett, of all these guys, Bennett was a mid-season acquisition. He was a mid-season trade acquisition by the Florida Panthers that has paid dividends for them. Because, again, top six guy, top six scoring depth. But they have also, they've created this great winning culture in Florida. And they have they've built up a team in which people are willing to go to for less to be lower in the lineup pieces that can help accentuate this top six. And from a Minnesota Wild standpoint, you've got Kirill, you've got Joel Eriksson, you've got Matt Boldy, you've got Marco Rossi, who at this point are pretty unquestioned top six players. The Wild are still 2 spots away from having a bona fide top six. And, for Florida too, Evan Rodriguez as a second line wing, maybe they could find an option that was a little better in that spot. But that's still an incredibly good top six. And from the center position, we've talked about the Minnesota Wilds in previous years, if you are an everydayer to this show, about how they just never had the sort of center depth that other teams had. Well, now we've seen Joel Eriksson blossom into a legitimate two-way threat, great defensively, and a 30-goal guy offensively. We saw the emergence of Marco Rossi. Will he be able to put back-to-back really solid seasons together to further his development? And you've got other players in the mix who could give you something similar to what the Florida Panthers have. Danila Yurov is a huge wild card in this because he could be better than Joel Eriksson and turn into a 1C to where Joel Eriksson is your 2, to where Marco Rossi is your 3, and then all of a sudden Marat Huznadinov is either a wing or lower down in the lineup. So having those guys that are bona fide, like it when you see it. And the thing with the Florida Panthers is that you could say you have Barkov, Bennett. You could also say Reinhart is good enough to be a center, but because of the depth that this Florida team has, he's a wing. That's the kind of thing that you need if you're going to be a legitimate contender for a Stanley Cup, is you need abundant depth, and not just like we've got players that can fill in if we suffer an injury or if somebody's out of the lineup. We've got guys that are good enough to play one position, but are playing another because of the depth that we have. You just stack the lineup. And the Wild do have, from a versatility standpoint, they do have the versatility locked down at least a little bit. Ryan Hartman is more of a wing, but he certainly can play center. He certainly has played center. But it's more about just continuing to build the depth at that center position. And it's very likely if Marat Huznadinov and Danila Yurov and Marco Rossi continue their development, and in the Huznadinov and Yurov cases, if they hit the ground running in extended looks, meaningful looks at the NHL level, then all of a sudden that's pretty good as a center lineup down the middle. Now, it could be that Yurov slots in more as a wing, and then you're looking for a center spot to throw in on, say, the fourth line. The key is just about having more options than you have spots for and figuring it out beyond that. Finding ways to get guys into the lineup to give you truly the best lineup you can have, and the lineup that can do some real damage. Now, in addition to that, you can't have the 30th ranked penalty kill in the NHL. And so blueprints to look for, there are going to be exceptions for sure, and we'll uncover them as we go through this. The blueprint is tremendous lineup depth, good centers, top 10 power play and penalty kill, and I feel like you got to be number 1 in either offense or defense and top 10 in the other. Because let's just look from a statistical standpoint. Goals against this past season. Let's see all the teams that made the playoffs. Florida, Winnipeg, Los Angeles Kings, Carolina, Boston, Vancouver, New York, Dallas, Seattle, Edmonton. One of the top 10 in fewest goals allowed missed the postseason, and that was the Seattle Kraken. How about on offense? Goals for Colorado, Toronto, Dallas, Edmonton, Tampa Bay, Vancouver, New York, Carolina, Detroit, and Nashville. In that same case, one of the top 10 missed out on the postseason. Power play percentage. Tampa Bay, number 1. Carolina, New York, Edmonton, Colorado, Dallas, Toronto, Florida, Detroit, and the Minnesota Wild were 10th. So here, 2 out of the 10 in terms of power play percentage. But the top 10 in penalty kill. Carolina, Los Angeles Kings, New York Rangers, Philadelphia Flyers, Tampa Bay Lightning, Florida Panthers, Boston Bruins, Dallas Stars, Calgary Flames, New Jersey Devils. So on the penalty kill side, there is a little bit more of an opportunity to get in if you're not in that top 10. But in all the other cases, 10% chance to get in if you're not in those categories, if you're not in the top 10 in those categories. So some interesting things for the Minnesota Wild to keep an eye on. I hope you enjoyed the start of this little dive into what makes past Stanley Cup champions tick. We'll talk Vegas tomorrow, then Colorado, and then Tampa Bay to finish off the week. But the big thing that I pull from the Florida Panthers is just the depth that they can throw at you at the center position. Guys that are great defensively, great offensively. They're well-rounded, and they can just take the game into their own hands. So that's the thing for the Wilds to pull on, and the hope is that the guys that they have coming up will be able to do that. It's on us to just wait and see. But that will do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. We thank you once again for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder once again, make sure to email a screenshot of proof that you are subscribed to the Locked On Wild YouTube channel for your chance to enter our Locked On Wild sweepstakes. Full rules can be found in the description of this episode. And also make sure to circle on your calendars. August 25th, Zambonis on 7th for the Locked On Wild meet and greet. Make sure to subscribe if you have not already so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We have new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.